The letter that changed everything. It all started on a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where nothing feels out of place until it does. The sun was barely above the rooftops, the air still carrying that crisp early hour coolness. I stepped outside with my coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than a quiet stroll to the mailbox. But tucked between the bills and the usual junk mail was an envelope that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. The HOA logo, printed in bold, judgmental letters, stared back at me. I already knew it wasn't going to be good news. With the HOA, it never was. Inside was a neatly typed letter, formal and cold, accusing me of violating Section 14B of the Neighborhood Aesthetic Code. According to them, my fence, an old, weathered wooden thing that had stood for years, was now non-compliant and unsightly. They claimed it was a blight on the neighborhood and demanded I replace it within 30 days or face a $500 fine. If I failed to comply after that, the fines would continue daily until the matter was resolved. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. It wasn't like my fence was falling apart. Sure, the wood had aged and the paint had faded, but it was solid and functional. I'd always thought it gave the property a rustic charm, especially compared to the soulless, cookie-cutter fences lining the other yards. But to the HOA, charm didn't matter. What mattered was uniformity, control, and the illusion of perfection. I walked the length of the fence that morning, running my fingers along the grain, feeling the roughness of the weathered wood. Every scratch and dent told a story. A storm that had passed, a branch that had fallen, a ball that had bounced too hard against it. Replacing it felt wrong, almost like erasing a piece of history. But the HOA didn't care about history. They cared about compliance. At first, I considered ignoring the letter. After all, my neighbors had worse things going on: paint peeling from their shutters, driveways cracked like dry earth. But then I remembered, the HOA didn't go after everyone. They went after whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And, right now, they wanted me. I looked around the neighborhood, wondering how many other fences had been deemed acceptable simply because the owners were friends with the board members. It was no secret that the HOA president, Linda Harmon, ran the association like her personal fiefdom. If she didn't like you or if you'd crossed her in the past, you became a target. I had crossed her, not intentionally, but enough to be on her radar. Last year, I had spoken up at a meeting about the rising HOA fees, questioning where the money was going. Linda didn't like questions, especially from people who weren't part of her inner circle. So here it was, my punishment, wrapped in legal language and delivered straight to my mailbox. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter under the harsh light of the lamp. Replacing the fence would cost thousands I didn't have. Painting it to match their approved colors felt like bending the knee. But doing nothing meant the fines would pile up until I drowned in debt. I knew I had to make a decision. It had to be one that wouldn't just solve the problem, but send a message. The idea came slowly at first, like a shadow forming in the corner of my mind. What if I didn't just comply? What if I complied in a way that turned their own rules against them? They said my fence had to be painted, but they never said how it had to be painted. That one small loophole was all I needed. I started researching late into the night, scrolling through HOA bylaws, reading every single word until my eyes blurred. There it was in black and white. The requirement was for fences to be painted in muted, non-distracting tones that were in harmony with the community aesthetic. The wording was vague, dangerously vague. It left room for interpretation, and I was ready to interpret it in the boldest way possible. But vague laws weren't my only weapon. I had something else: knowledge. Over the past year, I'd collected bits and pieces of information about the HOA board members' whispers of financial mismanagement, petty abuses of power, and scandals they thought no one knew about. I hadn't planned on using it, not until now. The more I thought about it, the more the plan took shape. I wouldn't just paint my fence. I would turn it into a canvas, a mural, telling the unvarnished truth about the very people trying to control me. Their hypocrisies, their secret feuds, their misuse of HOA funds, it would all be there for the world to see, in bold, undeniable color. It was risky, sure. They could fight back, maybe even try to sue. But the thought of their faces when they saw it for the first time, that alone made it worth it. I spent the next few days preparing. I took detailed photos of the fence, measured every plank, and started sketching rough designs. I visited art supply stores, picking out paints in colors that were just muted enough to pass inspection but vibrant enough to make every image pop. I cleared out my garage and turned it into a makeshift studio, ready to mix and match shades until I got them just right. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. The design was set, the supplies were ready, and the fence was waiting. All that was left was to put brush to wood. But as I stood in my yard that Saturday morning, paintbrush in hand, I realized something. Once I started, there would be no going back. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing up to people who thought they could control every inch of this neighborhood. It was about telling them, in the loudest way possible, that I wasn't afraid. So I dipped the brush in paint, took a deep breath, and made the first stroke. The first weekend passed quietly. I worked in measured bursts, each brushstroke deliberate, each color mixed with precision. From a distance, it looked harmless, just an intricate, muted-toned mural slowly taking shape. The HOA couldn't object. Yet, after all, I was complying with their demand. But the real power of the design was hidden in plain sight. Each section of the fence was more than art, it was coded truth. A cluster of roses in one corner concealed a pattern that, if you looked closely, formed the outline of a certain board member's luxury SUV, purchased suspiciously soon after a special assessment fee was collected. A serene landscape on another panel bore the faint silhouette of the HOA treasurer's vacation home, one no one in the neighborhood had known about until now. It wasn't obvious unless you knew what to look for, but that was the point. It was subtle enough to pass as art, yet specific enough to stir the whispers I wanted. By the third day, those whispers had started. It began with the neighbor across the street, who slowed down during his morning walk, leaning just far enough to get a better view. Then it was a group of teens biking past, stopping to point and squint, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Word spread fast in our little community. It always did. And soon, small clusters of residents began gathering near my fence, pretending to check their phones or adjust their shoelaces while they stole glances at the unfolding masterpiece. The reactions were mixed. Some smirked knowingly, their eyes lighting up as they connected the dots. Others looked uneasy, like they'd stumbled into something they shouldn't know. But one thing was certain, people were talking. By midweek, I could feel the tension shifting. The HOA board members still hadn't confronted me, but their cars began passing my house more frequently. I recognized Linda's white crossover creeping down the street more than once, slowing to a crawl before disappearing around the corner. She didn't stop, not yet, but I could tell she was watching. Meanwhile, I kept painting. I worked at dawn, when the light was soft and the neighborhood still quiet, and again in the evenings, when the golden hour made every color glow just a little warmer. Each plank became a chapter in the story, carefully chosen imagery that, to the untrained eye, was nothing more than decorative. But to anyone familiar with the inner workings of the HOA, it was a direct accusation. One section depicted a quaint, well-manicured street, except for one house at the end, rendered in crumbling gray. Subtle details in the windows revealed stacks of unopened envelopes, eviction notices, and foreclosure letters. This was a nod to the family the HOA had forced out last year over unpaid fines. Despite knowing the father had lost his job and the family was struggling, I remembered the day they moved out, their little girl clutching a stuffed bear as she climbed into the back seat. That image had stayed with me, and now it had a place on my fence. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but every stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming something the HOA had taken, not just from me, but from everyone they'd bullied into silence. By Friday evening, I was about halfway done. The fence had transformed from a plain boundary into a sprawling mural of intertwined scenes, each one a blend of beauty and quiet rebellion. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before now gave me small nods or knowing smiles when they passed. A few even lingered, pretending to comment on the weather while their eyes traced the images, and then came the first real sign that the board was rattled. That night, as I was cleaning up my brushes, I noticed an envelope tucked under my doormat. It wasn't in the HOA's official stationery, just plain white, with my name scrawled across it in rushed handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words: "You're making a mistake." No signature, no return address. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. More like a warning, but it confirmed what I already suspected. The board knew exactly what I was doing, and they were getting nervous. The next morning, I woke up to find a group of 3 residents standing near the far end of the fence, speaking in hushed tones. When they saw me, they nodded politely and walked off, but I could tell they were discussing the newest addition, a symbolic scene I'd painted late the night before. It showed a row of houses, each with a small tree in the front yard. One tree stood bare, stripped of leaves, its roots bound in red tape. It was an unmistakable metaphor for the HOA's strangling rules. By now, the mural had taken on a life of its own. Every addition sparked new theories, new conversations. People began approaching me in the grocery store, lowering their voices as they asked what certain parts meant. I never confirmed or denied anything. I didn't have to. The mystery was part of the power still. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. The more attention the fence drew, the more desperate the HOA would become to stop me. And with half the mural still to paint, I couldn't afford an early showdown. That's when I decided to accelerate my work. I took time off from my job, dedicating full days to the project. The faster I finished, the less chance they'd have to intervene before the story was fully told. But even as I worked faster, I noticed something strange. A few of the neighbors who had once avoided me now went out of their way to walk past my house. Some even left small cups of lemonade or bottles of water on the edge of the yard when I wasn't looking. It was subtle, but it felt like support, quiet rebellion against the board's stranglehold. By Sunday evening, the mural was 3/4 complete, and the images were no longer subtle enough to ignore. Anyone who saw them knew they were more than decoration, they were accusations, and that meant the clock was ticking before the board made their move. I was just rinsing my brushes when I saw Linda herself walking down the sidewalk toward my house. The first confrontation, Linda walked with the precision of someone who believed every step should make a statement. Even from a distance, her posture was rigid, her chin lifted just high enough to suggest authority without having to speak. The late afternoon sun caught the gold trim of her sunglasses, and the faint click of her heels carried down the quiet street like a countdown. I set my brush down, wiping my hands on a rag, and waited. The mural stretched behind me, still damp in places, the final quarter of its story yet to be told. The air felt heavier than usual, dense with anticipation. Linda stopped a few feet from the fence, her eyes scanning the images with the practiced neutrality of someone trying not to reveal just how rattled they were. But she lingered too long on certain details: the bare tree wrapped in red tape, the crumbling house at the end of the manicured street, the faint outline of a luxury SUV, half hidden in a bed of roses. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Her gaze finally shifted to me, and although she didn't speak, the message in her stare was clear. Stop this, now. Without a word, she reached into her bag and produced an official HOA violation notice. She held it out, but when I didn't immediately take it, she set it on top of the paint cans beside me. Then she turned and walked away without so much as a goodbye, her heels striking the pavement in a steady, measured rhythm until she disappeared. Around the corner, I didn't need to open the notice to know what it said. Some variation of your current project is in violation of community guidelines, followed by a threat of daily fines until the offending structure was removed or restored to compliance. It was their standard playbook: overwhelm you with legal-sounding language until you fold. But this time, the board had a problem. My fence, as controversial as it was, still fit their own rules. The colors were muted. The tones were technically in harmony with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Every image, no matter how suggestive, could be defended as artistic expression. They had no clause that banned art that makes us uncomfortable, though I was sure they wished they did. I left the notice on the workbench without opening it, a silent rejection of the power it was meant to carry. The next few days were different. I could feel the neighborhood shifting under the weight of what was happening. People weren't just glancing at the mural anymore, they were studying it, sometimes for long minutes at a time. Neighbors I'd never spoken to began making casual comments about how nice it was to see someone doing something creative, their voices laced with something more: approval, maybe even gratitude. But not everyone was pleased. A few residents crossed the street to avoid passing by. One man, a close friend of the HOA treasurer, stood on the opposite sidewalk for nearly 10 minutes one evening, arms folded, eyes locked on the fence like he was trying to burn it down with his glare. Still, the quiet support was growing. One morning, I found a sticky note tucked between the fence boards. In neat handwriting, it read, "About time someone said it." No signature, but it didn't need one. That same afternoon, a man I vaguely recognized from the far side of the neighborhood stopped on his way past and lingered longer than most. He didn't say a word, just tipped his baseball cap slightly before walking on. It wasn't much, but in a community where fear of the HOA kept most people silent, it felt significant. By Thursday, the board had escalated. I came home to find a letter taped directly to my front door, this one on official letterhead with Linda's signature at the bottom. It accused me of defamation and claimed my fence contained imagery designed to damage reputations and undermine the integrity of the HOA. They demanded I remove or cover the mural within 7 days or face legal consequences. It was an empty threat. They had no real grounds, but it confirmed what I suspected. The mural was hitting its mark. They weren't just annoyed, they were scared. I doubled down. That evening, I began painting the final quarter of the fence. These last sections were the most direct, yet no metaphors, no subtle symbolism. I depicted a set of scales tipping under the weight of dollar bills, the money flowing from houses into the pockets of faceless figures in suits. I painted a grand banquet table, each seat occupied by a shadowy silhouette, while smaller, faceless people stood outside in the cold, their plates empty. It was still art, still within the muted color scheme, but it left far less room for interpretation. Anyone who saw it would understand exactly what it was saying. That night, I heard voices outside my window. Peering through the blinds, I saw 3 board members standing in the street, pointing at the fence. They spoke in low tones, glancing toward my house every so often. Eventually, they left. But I knew they'd be back with something stronger than a letter next time, and I was right. 2 mornings later, just as I was mixing paint for the final plank, a certified letter arrived by courier. It was from the HOA's legal counsel. They were officially initiating legal review of my fence for non-compliance, defamatory content, and actions inconsistent with the peaceful enjoyment of the community. They were trying to drag me into court. The neighborhood turns. The legal notice sat on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I touched it again. Every time I passed by, the bold, blocky letterhead seemed to dare me to react, panic, call a lawyer, start scraping paint off my fence. But I didn't, because I knew something the HOA was only beginning to realize. The more they pushed, the more people noticed. By now, the mural wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a neighborhood phenomenon. People came at all hours to see it, their cars slowing as they passed, some even pulling over to get out and walk the length of the fence. I could hear snippets of conversations, laughter, outrage, speculation drifting through the air as strangers pieced together the meaning in each panel, and slowly, those whispers were becoming something else. It started small, a folded note, slipped into my mailbox with a few lines about things the board doesn't want people to know. Then another, with details about a questionable landscaping contract awarded to the HOA president's cousin. By the end of the week, I had a stack of anonymous tips, each one adding fuel to the fire I was painting. It was as if my fence had broken some invisible seal of silence. People who'd been too afraid to speak up for years were now finding ways to share what they knew, even if it was only through scraps of paper left in the dark. The HOA, meanwhile, was clearly losing its grip. Their newsletters grew longer and more desperate, filled with vague warnings about maintaining respect and avoiding divisive actions. But the more they insisted on unity, the more obvious it became that cracks were forming in their control. The shift became undeniable. On a Saturday morning, when I stepped outside to find a group of neighbors gathered near my fence, not just looking this time, but talking openly. There was no pretense of casual walks or accidental glances. They were facing the fence directly, gesturing to specific images, and trading stories. When they saw me, they didn't scatter. Instead, they nodded, some offering small smiles. A woman I recognized from the far end of the street handed me a thermos of coffee and whispered, "Don't stop." Then she turned back to the group as if nothing had happened. I didn't know it yet, but something was already in motion. That same day, a few residents began circulating a petition not against me, but against the HOA's recent actions. They called it a community accountability statement, and while the wording was careful, its meaning was clear. People were done being bullied. The petition gained traction quickly. By Monday, nearly a third of the neighborhood had signed, including several homeowners who'd previously been close with the board. I heard rumors that even one of the board's own members had quietly added their name. The pressure was building. and the mural was now at the center of it all, which meant finishing it wasn't just about my revenge anymore. It was about giving the neighborhood a rallying point they couldn't ignore. The final stretch of painting took on a new energy. I worked longer hours, sometimes after sunset, with neighbors occasionally dropping by to bring snacks or simply watch. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence was enough to tell me they were invested in seeing this through. For the last panel, I wanted something bold, an image that would tie everything together while leaving no doubt about the mural's message. I chose to paint a massive open ledger, its pages filled with rows of empty houses on one side and stacks of cash on the other. Above it, a set of faceless figures reached out, their hands dripping with the same muted gold that had run through the rest of the mural. It was the most confrontational image yet, but it was also the one that drew the most attention. Even before I'd finished, cars began stopping more frequently, people stepping out to take photos. Some nodded approvingly, others shook their heads, but no one walked away without looking twice. The HOA's reaction was swift. The morning after, the ledger appeared. They sent another letter, this time threatening an emergency community vote to authorize legal action against me. But it was too late. The vote would require majority support, and the petition circulating against them had already proven they didn't have it. By midweek, the whispers of a showdown turned into open talk. Residents began speculating about the next HOA meeting, which was only days away. Some said it would be ugly. Others said it would be historic. A few even suggested it could be the beginning of the end for the current board. The night before the meeting, I stood in my driveway and looked at the finished mural under the glow of the streetlights. It stretched the entire length of the fence, a living record of every abuse, every hypocrisy, every injustice the HOA had inflicted on the community. It was beautiful and damning all at once, and tomorrow it would be on full display in the one place the board could no longer ignore it. Their own meeting, in front of the people they'd ruled over for years. The meeting erupts. The community hall had never been this full. Every folding chair was taken, and people lined the walls in the back, some leaning against the doors, as if they were afraid the room might close in on them. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and anticipation, and the usual low murmur before HOA meetings had been replaced by a restless buzz. The mural was the unspoken centerpiece, though no one had to say its name. It had been photographed, shared, and dissected so many times over the past week that it might as well have been printed on the agenda. Everyone in the room had seen it, and everyone had an opinion. Linda sat at the head table with the rest of the board, her posture stiffer than ever. The other members wore strained expressions, scanning the crowd but avoiding eye contact with certain people. There was no mistaking the tension. It was the kind of tension that comes when a power structure senses it's losing its grip. When the meeting began, Linda tried to keep it business as usual. The first few agenda items, budgets, landscaping proposals, were handled with forced normalcy, but it didn't last. The first mention of community standards enforcement was like a spark in dry grass. Hands shot up across the room. People wanted to talk, not about budgets or maintenance, but about the mural. Some were calm, others angry, but all carried the same undercurrent of defiance. One by one, residents began voicing what had been whispered for years. They spoke about arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and the way the board seemed to protect its friends while targeting others. They didn't just bring up the fence, they brought up everything the fence represented. Linda tried to cut them off, reminding them of time limits, urging them to stay on topic. But the momentum had shifted, and the room was no longer hers to control. Each attempt to silence someone only drew more voices, more examples of grievances long buried. Then came the moment that cracked the meeting wide open. A resident from the far end of the street, one I'd barely seen outside before, stood up with a stack of papers in hand. He began reading aloud from them, detailing questionable expenses in the HOA's financial reports, landscaping contracts that had doubled in cost without explanation, consulting fees paid to companies with ties to board members. The words hung in the air like smoke, and the board's silence only made them heavier. Murmurs swelled into gasps, then into open accusations. People were no longer just questioning the board, they were calling for change. Someone mentioned the petition that had been circulating. Heads turned, nods spread through the crowd, and suddenly the conversation wasn't about whether the mural violated rules, it was about whether the board still had the right to enforce any rules at all. Linda tried to regain control, her voice sharp, declaring that these were baseless claims and personal attacks. But the residents had found their voice, and they weren't letting go. More stood up, adding their own experiences: fines for lawn decorations that matched others in the neighborhood, threats over paint colors, even harassment for hosting family gatherings deemed too loud. The board was visibly unraveling. 2 members sat rigid, staring at the table, while another began packing up his papers as if he couldn't get out fast enough. Linda's composure was cracking too, her words coming faster, her tone rising. And then, almost inevitably, someone brought up the mural directly. They said it wasn't vandalism, it was truth, that it was the first time in years anyone had dared to speak openly about what was going on. They called it "our fence, not mine," and a wave of murmured agreement rippled through the room. By this point, the board could no longer pretend the mural was just one homeowner's rebellion. It had become the symbol of something larger, challenged to the very foundation of their authority. A motion was made from the floor not to fine me, not to remove the mural, but to hold a special election to replace the board entirely. Gasps broke out, followed by applause from a corner of the room. Linda tried to block the motion, insisting it wasn't on the agenda, but the crowd pushed back. The HOA's own bylaws were cited by multiple residents, each one speaking louder than the last. It was chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos than I'd expected. This wasn't the board cornering, MIT was the neighborhood cornering them. The meeting dissolved into shouting, with residents demanding the election be scheduled and the board scrambling to end the session before it slipped completely out of their hands. When it was finally adjourned, the board left quickly, avoiding eye contact, their papers clutched tightly in their arms. But the residents lingered, clustering in small groups, their conversations urgent and animated. Walking home, I realized the mural had done more than tell a story, it had given people permission to act. And now that they'd found their voice, the board's days were numbered. The special election date was inevitable. The only question was what the board would do to try to stop it. The last play, the days after the meeting, were charged with a strange mix of tension and excitement. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, residents were talking openly, not just in hushed driveway conversations, but in broad daylight, on sidewalks, and over fences. The petition was still making the rounds, now with more signatures than anyone expected. The special election felt inevitable, but the HOA board wasn't done. 3 mornings after the meeting, I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps in the yard. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw 2 men in neon safety vests standing near the fence, measuring and snapping photos. A white SUV Linda sat idling at the curb. By the time I stepped outside, one of the men was unrolling a sheet of plastic tarp, the kind used for covering construction debris. Linda stood by the SUV, arms folded, a small, smug smile playing at the corner of her mouth. They didn't speak to me directly. One of the men simply handed me a folded document, an emergency safety notice, claiming the fence had been deemed a hazard and would be covered immediately pending further inspection. The language was laughably vague, no mention of what made it unsafe, no inspection report, no engineer's signature, just another manufactured excuse. It was a last-ditch effort to silence the mural before the election, but this time, they'd miscalculated. By the time I walked back inside to grab my phone, a crowd had already begun forming. Neighbors were streaming in from every direction, some still in pajamas, others holding coffee mugs. Someone had clearly called them, maybe even before I'd woken up. They weren't just there to watch, they were there to stop it. Voices rose as people demanded to see proof of the so-called hazard. Others questioned why no one had been notified in advance. A few even stood between the fence and the men in vests, refusing to move. Linda tried to keep her composure, insisting the board had full authority, but every sentence was drowned out by a wave of challenges. Residents quoted bylaws, demanded the names of inspectors, and pointed out the obvious. The fence had been standing for years without issue. Someone started filming on their phone, then another. Within minutes, half the crowd was recording, their lenses trained on the scene. The men in vests hesitated, looking to Linda for guidance. She barked something at them, but it was too late. Her voice was barely audible over the growing chorus of residents, calling her out by name. And then came the moment that ended it. From the far side of the street, the resident who'd read out the financial records at the meeting stepped forward, holding a folder. In it was a printed copy of an email and internal HOA message sent just the night before, in which Linda had instructed the board to find grounds to neutralize the fence. Before Saturday's election, the words were there in black and white, her name in the sender field. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by an eruption of voices. Someone shouted, "We've had enough," and others echoed it until it became a chant. The men in vests rolled up their tarp, muttering under their breath, and retreated to the SUV. Linda climbed in after them, her face pale, the door slamming harder than it needed to. The vehicle sped off, leaving behind a street full of neighbors who had just seen, with their own eyes, the lengths their board would go to hold power. By that afternoon, the email was everywhere, posted on community forums, shared in group chats, even taped to the bulletin board by the mailbox cluster. Whatever grip the board had left dissolved overnight. The special election happened 2 days later. Every seat was replaced. Linda didn't even show up. When the new board held its first meeting, one of their first orders of business was to declare the mural protected under a newly drafted homeowner expression clause. It would never be targeted again. The fence still stands to this day. The colors have faded slightly in the sun, but the images remain clear. The roses, the crumbling house, the bound tree, the ledger. People still stop to look, some for the first time, others returning to remember. For me, it's more than just art now. It's a record of a fight that started with one letter in my mailbox and ended with a neighborhood reclaiming its voice. And every time I walk past it, I'm reminded, the HOA thought they could use their rules to control me. Instead, I used their rules to expose them.